Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Remote Administration of the Ortiz PVAT, an instructional guide for online testing. Before we get started, we'd like to share some suggestions for optimizing your webinar experience today. We recommend you connect by computer. We also suggest you use a hardwired Ethernet connection rather than Wi-Fi and recommend using headphones. Additionally, close all other browsers and applications for the best experience. Just a few additional logistics before we get started. You all have been placed on mute so that background noise is kept to a minimum. However, we do want to hear from you. In the GoToWebinar panel, on the right-hand side, you will see a question pane. Please type in your questions in the question pane, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can towards the end of today's session. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and available on demand in about 1 week for any of your colleagues who are unable to attend the live session. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be with us. Now, a little bit about who we are for those of you who are meeting us for the first time. We are MHS. We provide data-driven solutions across our core disciplines. With advanced toolsets, we help clients evaluate, track, and leverage human-centric data to realize potential. Our mission is to consistently advance our science and research capabilities because progress has no limits. We are located in Toronto, Canada, and have been in business for over 30 years. Our solutions are available in over 50 languages, and we have a presence in 75 countries around the world, so we are truly global. Please visit our website or follow us on social media to learn more about us. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenter. Samuel Ortiz, Ph.D., is a professor of psychology at St. John's University. In addition to his doctorate, he holds a PPS credential in school psychology with postdoctoral training in bilingual school psychology. His research and publications focus on cognitive and linguistic assessment of culturally and linguistically diverse individuals and methods for differentiating cultural linguistic differences from disorders. He is the primary developer of the Culture Language Interpretive Matrix and CHC cross-battery assessment. Now over to Dr. Ortiz.
Good morning and good afternoon to many of you across the country. Nothing like doing a little social distancing with 650 plus of my closest friends. So I can't believe that many of you actually showed up here, but I'm glad that you did, and I hope this is going to prove to be worthwhile for you. I want to take you through basically the steps and the issues that you need to be aware of to be able to administer the test remotely. And I was speaking with one of the developers who did a good deal of the psychometrics, and that would be Joanna, who's actually going to be my test subject later. And we were talking about how the test was really future-oriented and forward-looking in the sense that we wanted it to be digital, and we wanted it to be something that would provide a more modern alternative to having to carry around test kits and do things sort of the old way. And I guess this situation, unfortunate as it is, kind of highlights perhaps our prescience in that respect, in that the Ortiz PVAT is one of the tests that you can actually administer pretty easily online, primarily because its digital nature, as well as the lack of actual direction once the test begins, makes it pretty ideally suited for this kind of scenario. I suspect that's why a lot of you are probably chiming in. So let me get over to my slide deck here and be able to show you what I want. I'm going to go to my PowerPoint here. I'm going to reduce my video there. Yeah, let me double check, make sure. Oh, here we go. Okay. Trying to get my screen up here. Right. And okay. All right. So hopefully everyone can see this here. And I know you can still see me as well, but I have on screen the beginning of the PowerPoints that I have and where I wanted to begin. And if there's anything going on, I'm sure one of the organizers will just chime in and let me know if anything's not showing up right. But basically, this is the link and the web page that has the newly developed remote administration guidelines that I worked with MHS in putting together. And the link for it, you can see, is at the bottom down here. So if you want to write that down, it'll always take you directly to this page where you can get the guidelines in written form. Now, this is the actual web page itself, but you can see that there's a couple of buttons that permit you to actually do some downloads. So if you want to download these instructions, if you click that button there, it will allow you to download a PDF document that will have basically the same wording so that you can print it or have it electronically without having to go to the website directly. If you want to see what that looks like, it's like this. So basically it's the same idea, it's formatted just slightly differently, but it has the same exact information available to you. And I'm going to cover this because I want to discuss a little bit of it, at least briefly, so you get an idea of what's in it. There's also another document you can download when you're on the web page, and it's on the right-hand side there. And those are the English task instructions. So one of the changes we had to make was when you're talking with the examinee and you're trying to explain to them what the task actually is, you have to change the wording a bit, because now you're not sitting next to them with the device in a hand where they can touch it with their finger or they can use a mouse to click, so because things are done a little bit differently, you have to modify the language. And I found that in practicing this, it's not easy to do that on the fly. And it's good to have an actual script that you can follow so that it makes it easy for you to do that. In fact, this is what the PDF version of that script looks like. And I've actually taken the liberty of printing it out so that when I do the administration, I'm actually just going to read right from it. It's very brief and it's very short. And after you've probably done it a couple times, you probably would have it memorized anyway. It's not difficult to remember, and it's closely aligned with what the instructions would be anyway. All right. Now, here are the specific recommendations. Obviously, we're saying that this test is appropriate for remote administration because of its digital nature and the structure of it. And it really only requires minor modification in order to be able to administer it in the ways that you would hope to do so. Certain things that I think are important, and this would apply not just to the Ortiz PVAT, but to doing any kind of remote administration in general. Because the material you're presenting is copyrighted, it's not advised, and it's probably a violation of copyright if it is recorded in some way, either by you or by the person on the other end. I don't know specifically how you can stop people on the other end from actually doing that, but it is something you'll want to say and maybe add to any kind of prefacing that you give to parents if you're working with children or to adults themselves, that this is a requirement of the administration that they not record it and that it not be recorded in any way. All right, so just something you want to be aware of in that respect. Now, the other issues are very similar. You want to make sure the test environment is no different than what you would ordinarily do if you were actually working with the individual, directly. You want it to be a distraction-free kind of environment. You want there to be, comfort, that the person doesn't have to feel like they're sitting in a situation in which it's difficult to take the test, or there's too many distractions going on. I know it happens all the time, and sometimes you can't stop. Like if you're working with children, their siblings from running across the screen in a stormtrooper outfit or something. It happens, or people will video bomb. But you at least want to stress that it should be something that is done quietly, more privately, without much distraction. Now, one of the things we do absolutely require, and you should make sure that happens, is that the examinee wears headphones. All right, any kind of headphones that they have. I have a pair here that I usually use. I'm not using mine right now, and I'll explain why when I get to it. But you want to make sure that the examinee is absolutely wearing headphones because it improves the audio quality significantly. It's not impossible to do it from the speaker on a computer, but tablets and most computers just don't have great sound systems, and it may make it more difficult for them to actually hear. Plus, having the headphones on reduces the distraction and extraneous noises that might be in the environment, so therefore it's always a good thing to do. You yourself, as the examiner, don't have to have them, but it is recommended, strongly required, strongly recommended and required that the examinee actually have it. Make sure your internet connection, audio connections are working properly. I'll show you how and when you should be making sure that happens, but having that set up ahead of time is important because you don't want to get to there and then suddenly, you know, your audio's not, let's say, being consistent, and it's checking in and out, or your video is pixelating and causing problems or delaying. You just don't want that. If you can be hardwired, obviously, to an Ethernet connection, that would be ideal. These days, Wi-Fi is getting better, so maybe that's less of a problem, but just make sure that it's okay. I think I've covered the rest of that. Software requirements, hardware requirements are the same. Probably the only thing you want to make double sure about is that the individual is not trying to take the test on a phone, okay, on an iPhone or a regular phone. It's really kind of small, and that's probably not appropriate. So you want to make sure that they see the screen and that it's a good size screen. It has to be 7.9 inches minimum. So like an iPad mini is about the smallest device that they should actually be working with. As you work with them, you should be able to observe them. You're going to see that when I set up the video, I have it to the side so that I can see them at all times. You want to be able to make sure that they're not chewing gum, they're not trying to eat or drink, or in some other way being distracted. These are just good things that you would be doing anyway, but the same thing applies. You can't be there in person with the examinee, so you want to make sure that at least you can see that there isn't, you know, too many distractions going on, that everything seems to be okay. I mentioned the script for following the remote administration guidelines. You can see on the screen there's a link for it right there. It's the same link as the one I showed you before. It will allow you to download the instructions to be able to have them for you so that you can follow along. One of the things that's going to be very important is to make sure that the child is able to understand and recognize and articulate the numbers from at least 1 to 10. Technically, only 1 to 4 is required, but if a child only knows the first 5 numbers, you're probably treading on thin ice there in terms of administration. The reason for this is that ordinarily in face-to-face, the child can actually touch or just point to whatever their response would be. They don't have to verbalize at all. In this case, since they can point, but you can't see what they're pointing to, then it's necessary for them to tell you what they're pointing to. And below each picture in the test is a number from 1 to 4. So all they have to do is actually just tell you the number. Now, this may not be much of an issue for most kids. However, if you're working with, let's say, very young children, preschool children, the chances that, you know, a 2.5-year-old will know the numbers well enough from 1 to 4, 1 to 10 to be able to take the administration, it's possible, but you'd have to really check that out to be sure. Likewise, if you're working with English learners and they have just begun to learn the language, so they have very limited knowledge of English, they may not know them as well either. I think it's reasonable to consider that you could probably teach them the numbers, since numbers tend to be a little bit more universal than words. It's not difficult to do, but unless you're absolutely sure that the person can articulate the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 to you, it's probably best to consider not doing the administration until they can at least do so. All right. One of the things I want to point out also during the testing is that you actually don't do much during the testing. The examiner, once they've explained the task instructions to the child, you just sit back and the child is, or the examinee, I'm sorry, is giving you the response and you're just marking it and moving forward. There is very little involvement on your part and no need for any actual administration of items after the practice items. So it's only during the practice session where you're working out making sure that the examinee understands exactly what you want them to do, exactly what's expected of them during the task, and that's how you run through that. So it's ideal because there really isn't anything you have to do after that. The administration of the items is almost pretty much self-paced and self-administered, with you observing the administration rather than having to interact. There are a couple of times you might need to do that, as you can see from the instructions. If the child tells you that they want to go back, then you'll have to click the back button for them. If they want to skip an item, they'll have to tell you that, although you would then instruct them that it's best not to skip. It's better if they actually guess. So there's a couple things. They might want you to repeat the stimulus word, so you'll have to click the speaker icon for them. As you'll see in the demonstration, we'll cover that a little bit. But those are the only times you'll have to intervene. In most cases, you won't really have to do anything. Make sure you're watching as they are taking the exam to document any behavioral kind of reactions, observations, or anything that you notice that might be helpful, just like you would if you were doing an in-person administration. Okay. Now, at the very bottom of the guidelines, both on the web page and the PDF version, you'll find this kind of summary. And the summary here is just a shorthand way of making sure that you get things set up and that you're covering the main points. So for example, making sure that the individual you're working with is using headphones so that they can hear the stimulus properly and so that it reduces any kind of distraction. You're also looking at keeping their video feed visible to you so that you can see them. It's not important that they see you at all. In fact, when I'm working with Joanna coming up, I'm going to reduce my video feed so that I'm not on the screen. I just want them to see the test itself, and I want to see them on my screen because that's all you really need. Another thing that you want to do is not to share your screen or the content until you get to the point where you're ready to begin the test. So there's a lot of preparation going on, which I'll show you and demonstrate, that you want to get out of the way before you actually then log in and say, okay, let's do this now, and you get everything set up and then you begin the test. The practice items you're going to see are given in normal fashion, really not much change there other than the wording, which I'll go through. You'll explain that they can go forward, they can go back, they can repeat the stimulus if they need to. Once the practice items are continued, then you actually move into the actual testing. Remember that the test has a built-in screener that provides an automatic starting point for the child based on their age, as well as their response to the screener items. So the test knows where to take the child to the appropriate starting point without putting them at a point that's too hard for them and without putting them at a point that's too easy for them, but without having to require that they take all the real easy ones that they probably would have gotten anyway. Same thing for the ceiling. Once the ceiling is met, then the program will simply end and you'll see that it says the test has been completed and you'll be pretty much all done. From that point on, doing what you're doing with respect to how you would score, how you would generate the report is all the same as if you had just done it face-to-face, because it goes up to the cloud anyway. You log into the MHS assessment portal, and from there you just do everything exactly as you would have done it before. So there's no real changes. So let me give you some tips here before I get into the actual demonstration that should help you along. Number one, when you start the Ortiz PVAT, the actual application, you might see it in full screen mode. If you do, you probably want to change that so that it's in a windowed view or windowed option rather than full screen, because if you do it full screen, it actually may hide the video and you won't be able to see it. Sometimes full screen application takes over and it hides the video away from you, so you don't want that to happen. So by clicking that button there, it allows you to make that window a little bit smaller. You can do that not just there, but you can do it once you get to this part, which is where you're going to see that once I get to, then I'll start actually working with Joanna to begin the test. So we're not there yet. When I go through the actual live demonstration and I get to this point, that's when I'll make sure that it's set. So if you want to come to this window, and again, window it so that you can then see everything on your screen, this is the best place to do it, because this is the point at which you're about to begin the actual administration. So getting everything set properly at this point is what you really want to do. Now, one other thing that you want to remember is when you choose the option to share your screen and to share your content, or whatever it's called, by whatever application you happen to be using, you don't want to choose screen or desktop or full screen, because it'll show everything that you pop up. That makes it easy when you don't really care what's going on. But in this case, with the administration, what you want to do is you want to choose the specific application that you want to share. So sometimes they call it, shared application, or they'll list the application name like PowerPoint or Word. In this case, you want to choose the Ortiz PVAT, as I've highlighted here, because that will allow the person to only see full screen your application, or that is the Ortiz PVAT in terms of the administration. So that's all they will see. Okay, you will see it in the window with the video, but they will only see that. And that's really the ideal way you want to do it. If you go to showing your screen, then you may have trouble in terms of getting it set up properly in terms of the way that it should look and everything. So that said, here's an example of what I'm talking about. You can see that I've reduced the screen itself so that the windowed application now for the administration is a little bit to my left on my desktop. And then you can see the desktop sort of in the background right over here behind, this text box. And then I put, and this is my wife, who was my subject this morning, who graciously volunteered to be my test subject. So she's in the upper right-hand corner, but that allows me to see her. So now you can see where when I start the test and the practice items, I'll see the stimulus exactly as the examinee is seeing it, but I also can observe them here. But their screen is different. What they see is only the Ortiz PVAT. They do not see my video because I will have shut my video down, or I'm not sharing my video, but I need to see their video in that case. Right now, when I give the test, I'll probably will leave my video on so you guys can see me while I'm doing that. But what I would ordinarily do is I would turn it on and off with the button that would allow me to be able to mute my video so that I'm not seen at all. Because again, the examinee doesn't need to do that. This is, the first practice item. When I get there in the live demo, I'll show you how that works. But you can see again that I'm able to see the items. The person is in the video. I'm able to then, explain the instructions to them, give them the instructions, and then make sure that they're understanding what's going on. And it's through this that they would communicate to me what their answer would be. And as you can see, they would have to pick out either number 1, number 2, number 3, or number 4. So if they pick number 2 because that's Apple, then I will click on that for them, and then I will hit the next button so that I'm actually in control of the pacing there. But it's dependent upon the response of the individual in terms of how they do it. All right, so I'm going to show you a live setup here. Let me get out of this, and let me share now the desktop with you. All right. Okay, and I'm going to call up my Ortiz PVAT here, and hopefully you should be able to see that. Now, again, if I had the video up, I don't have Joanna there yet, but this is one place where I could reduce my window and say, okay, I want to make sure that it's okay. So if I click this button, it sends it over like that. So now I have my desktop open to the right, and I have the application to the left, and I'd be able to go in and do it. So I'm just going to log in. I've already put my information there. I've got my wife's name as the sample case there because I was playing with her, but we're going to launch Joanna Jones, not her real last name. And she's going to be the person I'm going to work with. But you know how the application currently helps you to review the information that you put in when you set up the case. So I'm not going to have my wife's name as a sample case there because I was playing with her, but we're going to launch Joanna Jones, not her real. I'm getting some my own feedback here. I think I better. Let me put my headset on until I get to the part where I need to. Okay. I put my headset back on because I want to make sure that I'm not getting feedback while I get to the part where I'm going to work with Joanna. And what I'm doing here is essentially, this is the information that I used to set up the case. And obviously when you come here, it asks you to go ahead and select the grade. So at 9 years old, we're going to say Joanna's a 4th grader, and we're just going to click next. We're going to use English speaker this time around. I know we'll probably have some questions about English learners in terms of what the differences might be. I'll address that a little bit later. So right now, we're just going to go ahead and jump to that. And then we're going to do standard administration using Form A, which is what we always recommend that you do anyway. You can put the examiner name in, and you would be okay. And then now we get to here. All right. So this is where we're going to start. And this is where I have to take my headphones off now. So if anybody has their microphones on, I would ask you to make sure that it's muted, including the organizers. And before I bring Joanna up, because I want to demonstrate so that everybody can hear the sound. So I'm going to take my headset off and go back to not using them. Okay, so if I've done everything correctly and I click on the button here, this is where I would do the sound check.
Apple.
And I hear it coming from mine. I'm hoping that everybody else is hearing it as well.
Apple.
The problem with the headset and not being able to use it on my end is that my headset, this one in particular, has a built-in microphone right here. So it channels the sound back to here rather than through the computer itself. So the sound is coming through here. It's not going through the actual system, and that prevents it from being heard by the examinee. So if you have a setup where perhaps you're just using headphones without a microphone, you could probably still do that. But that's the kind of thing you want to make sure that everything is okay. And you could probably even call the person up now and say, all right, I think I'm ready to go. I think I have everything set. So I'm going to say, Joanna, I would be contacting you now and asking you to log in. And I want you to share your video with me so that I can actually see you and put you on the screen and make sure that I get you set up correctly. So I'm going to wait for Joanna to pop up at this point.
Hi, Sam.
There we go. Okay. And I want to see your webcam, Joanna, and I have to find you, I think, probably on the attendees or organizers, because I don't see your, hold on one second until I find you. Okay, I'm going to show, I'm switching to show all webcams. There we go. And you and I are the only two now. So now I only have you. And then I'm going to minimize myself here. Okay, usually it will let me do that, but it's not letting me do that. Well, I'm going to move us over here. All right. And Joanna, do you see me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I want to not see me. So I'm actually going to have to mute my video so that you don't. All right. So now you just see me, right?
Mm-hmm. But
Okay.
I see your screen.
Good. Okay. So you hear me okay? And if I play the stimulus,
Apple.
you hear it okay as well?
Yes.
Okay. And I see you on my screen. Hopefully the participants, those of you who are watching right now, you can see Joanna on my desktop over to the right, and then you see the administration of the test over to the left. So now I'm able to observe her while I'm actually going to give her the test. So now that we have the sound check and we know everything is working properly, I can move into the practice. So I'll click the button to move into the practice. When I do the practice, you notice it does not say the word because now I have to get my script and I'm going to read to her. So I'm going to say, Joanna, look at each of the 4 pictures on the screen. Each picture has a number below it. Now you will hear a word spoken like this.
Apple.
And I click the button, I play it for her, and then I say, I want you to look at the pictures and tell me the number that goes with the picture that best describes the word you just heard.
Apple. 2.
Okay. So she says 2, so I'm going to click on 2 and you'll see that it'll highlight it. Now, she got that correct, so my next response to her would be, good. There are a few other things I want you to know. If you would like to hear the word again, just tell me and I will replay it as many times as you want, like this. So I'll just click. Okay. You can change your answer by telling me the number of the picture you want instead. So if you want number 1, you can just tell me 1, and then I would change her response that way. After you tell me your answer, I'll click the next button and move on to the next word. Okay, and I'll bring the cursor down to the next button and do that. If you want to go back to the last word you just heard, just tell me and I'll click the back button for you. And basically, I will control that for her as we move along. If you aren't sure of your answer, just tell me the picture that you think is best. Okay? Now let's try practicing with a few more words.
Tree. 3,
Play.
2,
Hot.
1.
Okay, so now after the first 4 practice items, it's very clear that Joanna knows what she's doing. She understands what's going on. If I were having difficulty in getting her to understand the task, I would click on the More Practice button here, and I would get 4 additional practice items. So I'll repeat that one for her. You don't need to do these, Joanna. I'll narrate through it. But this would give the individual a chance to practice some more. Now, one of the things that's important is that we already have these instructions, at least for the normal administration of the test, in 5 different languages. So there's Chinese, Arabic, Vietnamese, Russian, and Spanish. If you need to translate or somehow work with an English learner who doesn't understand what you're saying, this is what you are translating. You're not translating the word itself.
Ball.
So you would never actually translate that. You would simply be translating the instructions in terms of trying to get the examinee, like Joanna, to understand what you want them to do. And that's why I said there's some limitations. If the child can't say the numbers from 1 to 4, even in their own native language, that could still be a problem. And for those of you who are working with somebody who needs this level of assistance, and if you're not bilingual, that means you may need somebody to assist you in terms of providing that kind of translation or that interpretation. So again, that's a limitation that could happen when you're not working face-to-face, where you're trying to explain something that is going to be a little bit more difficult than if you're doing it in person. I mean, if you're doing it in person, the person just has to put their finger on the picture that is right. It really doesn't require any explanation, any expressive language, any real learning other than comprehension of the task itself. Okay,
Shoes.
so I'll just cut through these quickly.
Hand.
There are 4.
Jumping.
Okay, and I get to jumping. Now, one of the things that you'll notice as I go through the test is some things will light up and some things will flash. I'll explain them as they happen, but you'll see that I'll be paying attention to the speaker icon, and you saw the next button just light up now. These are timing indicators that tell me how much time has actually passed. So when the speaker icon flashes yellow, it means 10 seconds have passed. When the next button lights up, it means 15 seconds have passed. And at that point, if the person hasn't responded, you want to encourage them to respond by saying it's okay to take a guess if you're not sure of the answer. All right. All right. So when I finish the practice, I'm back to where I started, and I would just make sure, or, I read the sentence before, but I would say, are you ready, Joanna? Are you ready to begin now? And I'd make sure everything's okay. I don't see anybody in the background. It looks like she has normal time and everything. So we would just start, and I would click the button.
Tub.
3,
Pasta.
1,
Pills.
3,
Fresh.
2,
Spoon.
2,
Sing.
4,
Okay, one of the things that I want to advise you on is that it's very, very tempting as you're waiting for the person's response to move the mouse up to where the picture is. So you have to really resist that temptation quite a bit. You want to leave it down by the next button or by the speaker icon and wait for that response before you move it over. Otherwise, you're prompting them to do it. So if you do something like this.
Asleep.
4.
Yeah, it pretty much then cues them into what the correct response actually is. I also want to mention at this point that Joanna's actually in the middle of the test now, because we started actual testing with item spoon. And I know that because I know the structure of the test and the screener and how it operates. And so I pointed out, because you saw how seamless the test was in going from the screener items to the actual items itself. So based on how she responded to the first few items and the first one that she got wrong, and based on her age, it takes her to the correct starting point. And it does it without you having to even really think about it. Just does so automatically. All right.
Book.
1.
Kitten.
Can you play the sound again?
Sure.
Kitten.
2,
Table.
4,
Helicopter.
3,
Doll.
1,
Blocks.
4,
Mother.
can we go back to the last one?
Sure.
Blocks.
Okay, next.
Mother.
4,
Cup.
3,
Okay, so at this point, the test has been completed. Obviously, Joanna was missing many of them on purpose, and the program kicked in with the ceiling rule, which is basically 5 incorrect responses out of the last 10 that were administered. And so it just stops, and she doesn't see any additional stimuli. It just basically says the assessment is actually complete. And in fact, it is. At this point, there is no difference any further from what we have done now to what we would have done with the face-to-face administration. Because when I exit from the program, it simply uploads the information to the MHS assessment portal and allows us to be able to go in and to generate the actual report. I don't think I need to demonstrate that because, again, it's not any different than what it needed to be before. So I'm going to turn my video back on here so that you guys can see me once again, and I'll exit the program. All right, and I just want to wrap up, see if there are any things that were necessary or important for me to explain, but I think that's really pretty much it. There's not a lot that you have to do other than really go back in now, sign into the portal, run the report, and you get the same thing that you've had previously. So there's not a lot that changes after that. It's only the administration that you want to make sure that it goes properly and that it works properly and that everything is done accordingly. So I believe that probably takes care of the demonstration, and I know we have some time left to be able to answer some questions, and I'm sure that there are many questions going on there. I think I was holding my head here while Joanna was responding, right, and I got a little red spot. Anyway, I'm going to ask the organizers to come back on. I'm going to probably stop sharing my screen so that they can move into it. And here, let's see, I'm stopping my sharing, and I'll return this now over to the organizers and try to answer some of the questions that you all might have regarding the administration. I'm waiting for, oh, let's see. Okay, no, Form,
All right.
are you?
I'm here, yes. So we do have some time for a Q&A session, and so we actually have received quite a few questions here that we can go through.
Okay.
Let me just pull up a question here. Okay, so we've received quite a few. The first question here, Robin asks, so there have been a few concerns that the California Association of School Psychology has expressed in regards to virtual assessments, and the biggest concern being the testing environment and being able to view the room that the client is in and not just their face. Would you be able to address some of these concerns?
Well, I think their concerns are well-founded. What we're doing here isn't ideal, and it's certainly not the way the test itself is actually normed. So the concerns are well-founded. But I believe that, under what I would say are exigent circumstances, this is about the best you can do and the best that can be hoped for. I do agree that if you want to make sure that the environment is okay, I'm going to do what I would recommend is, you have the person kind of, move their camera around and make sure that everything looks okay. You want to make sure that they're comfortable enough to be able to take the exam or take the test. And that means that they have to feel comfortable in the setting, in the situation, and everything that's going on. So I think it's important that you do make sure that that's what's happening. One of the things that we recommend is that you keep your camera in like widescreen mode, you know, because you do have the option of changing it. If I go to webcams and I go to preferences like this, I can change that to 4:3, and you see it cuts it down to here, and I can't see quite as much. So if you ask the person at least to make sure that they're in wider screen mode, then you're kind of more aware of what's going on around them. But I don't know that you're ever going to be able to prevent people from, again, stepping in, causing distractions, and that's just part of the nature of doing this type of testing. That's why I don't think it's meant, and it's not going to replace face-to-face or in-person testing. But if you do your best in terms of making sure that you handled the situation as well as could be handled, I don't think anybody's going to fault you for that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz. Another question here that we've received is in regards to having dual monitors. Will this remote administration process work with having 2 monitors?
Yeah, yes, it will, but it's a little more complicated doing that. I actually have my device that I'm looking at you right now, and I have a second monitor up behind it. But I didn't do the dual screen because not everybody has that capability. But you have to then know where to go in the controls, both for your computer as well as in the video platform that you're using, to allow it to use a second screen. And in that way, you could simply put the test on one screen and then put the video feed from the examinee on your other screen, and they would be side by side. So yes, you can absolutely do that. It's a little more complicated to do that, and I tried to stay away from it to try and keep things as simple as possible, but certainly you could.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Another question that we've received is, can the examinee use hand gestures to indicate the response, or are only verbal answers appropriate?
Whatever way the individual can communicate with you what their response is, in this case, under this circumstance, is probably entirely appropriate. Do they have to say the number 1, 2, 3, 4? No. If they want to hold up fingers, 1, 2, 3, or 4, I'm perfectly okay with that. This is actually perhaps analogous to testing with deaf and hard of hearing population, something I get asked about quite a bit and really hoping to move forward with. But you know, if the person can only communicate that way and they can tell you what the response is, that would be fine. The problem is, of course, that if they're deaf and hard of hearing, they're not hearing the stimulus, and you need somebody to be telling them what that is. But the communication, whether it's language that is oral, or it's language that is nonverbal or gestural, or whether it's actual sign language, doesn't make any difference. They can communicate that to you. Remember, you're the one that's actually clicking on the response they give you. How they communicate it to you is largely irrelevant.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Another question here that we've received is, can you clarify if you mentioned if you were able to translate the word for the examinee? How can we test a Spanish speaker student?
You do not translate the word at all. That's in the guidelines and in the summary at the very bottom, in terms of like this task script that I was holding up. Right there at the bottom, it says no attempt should be made to translate the stimulus words. The test is a test in English, okay? And this is something I think people often get mistaken about. The test is not a test just for English learners, and it's certainly not a test just for Spanish English learners. There were 53 different languages sampled in the Norman group for English learners, 53 different ones. What is translated are the instructions in terms of what the person is supposed to do. We're trying to measure their English language ability, not trying to measure their native language ability. So therefore, if they're not a monolingual native English speaker, they need to be compared only to other English learners who've been learning English for the same amount of time, whether that's just been a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, or 10 years. And so to do that, you can explain the task to them in the native language. These instructions here, you can, if you want to translate these into the native language, that would be fine. I have no problem with doing this. These are the task instructions. The practice items that I gave Joanna, that's what I was using. But when you play the stimulus, when you say you're going to hear a word like this, when you click the next button, that word is always in English and only in English. It cannot be translated must not be translated, and the test is not given in that kind of manner. And remember that once we actually started the test with Joanna, if she wanted to go back and she wanted to tell me that in the native language and I could understand her, I'd be happy to go back. That doesn't matter. But the word itself, the stimulus word, must always be presented in English, and really there's no other way to do it. But please do not try or attempt to translate the stimulus words. They must be given as they have been developed in English.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Another question here is in regards to the remote administration and the validity of the test itself. And so with this modified administration process, how does the test validity get affected?
Well, it's affected. How much it's affected, probably nobody's going to ever know. There's no way to necessarily determine that unless we tried to standardize the test in this way and then compare the norms and so on, which a lot of people are not going to do. You have to understand this is not the recommended administration. This is not what we say you should do. This is what we're saying you can do under situations like, you know, where we have the social distancing guideline, a pandemic that is causing isolation, and the need to continue to try and work with individuals as best we can. Well, this is as best we can under those circumstances. If these circumstances did not exist, you probably wouldn't have any justification for administering the test this way. Well, I say any, but perhaps under very, very limited kinds of circumstances, you could do so. So this is an alternative. Now, in terms of affecting the validity, again, while you can make the case and say, you know, there's got to be some effect, and there probably is, the administration of the items themselves isn't a lot different other than you're not there with the person to observe their response, and they're not making their response by touching it or by clicking a mouse. They're creating a response by holding up fingers or telling you what the number of the picture is. So that differs in terms of how they're indicating their response, but they do not, you know, do much else other than, again, the verbalization of the response if they're choosing to do it that way. The administration is exactly the same. The items are exactly the same. There's no modification of anything. There's no change in time limits, no change in the nature of scoring. None of that changes. So as far as tests go that are given under these conditions, and you know that every publisher is providing recommendations for the administration of tests, even tests that are not digital, which would be exceptionally complicated to give under these types of conditions. They're promoting and they're saying, well, you know, this is the best you can do, but they're not going to claim that, oh, it's completely, totally, fully valid. It's about, again, as valid could be under the present circumstances. So you've got to note that. Just put that into your report when you're writing it up saying you had to do a modified administration. There are a lot of people that are doing that now. I know many of you who are bilingual do administrations where you're accepting responses in another language. You're, you know, translating the test or the instructions just like we're doing here. Those are modifications that need to be in the report to indicate that the test was given under non-standard conditions. That doesn't prevent people from trying to use that information or those obtained test scores in making their diagnostic determinations. People do it all the time. If you use an interpreter, it's non-standard administration. So it's not like it doesn't happen. It's just you want to note it, you want to be upfront about how it happened, and then you want to have some way of determining whether you believe that the results obtained from that non-standard administration are indeed valid and why you think so. If you can defend it, you can justify it, then I think you're on solid ground. Again, given the present circumstances.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Here we have another question, and this is regarding the last question you answered. You mentioned that we can give directions in the examinee's language. Can the examinee also answer in their language for the numbers that they're saying?
I think under, again, this type of condition, absolutely, because it's actually an increased kind of requirement to have the individual verbalize something. The test is meant to be a receptive understanding. So we're not trying to test whether or not they can actually communicate to you that understanding. So what they really are communicating to you is only what response they want. So if they can do that and say, that's my response, that's my response, that's my response, however they can do that, then that's perfectly acceptable. Because again, we're not scoring their ability to articulate that word in their native language. We're only evaluating their ability to comprehend that word receptively. And if they can do so and then communicate to you which picture is that word, then that's still perfectly legitimate, perfectly valid, and I have no problem with that. I think you're on solid ground.
Absolutely. Here we have another question about that sheet of directions again. You refer to 5 languages that those directions can be used in, and we're asking for clarification here on what those 5 languages were.
Yeah, these instructions for the remote administration have not yet been translated into the 5 languages, but the instructions from which this was derived, because these are altered instructions for the English administration, okay? So there are 5 additional administrations standard that look just like this that you could then modify with this language in those languages. Those 5 are Spanish, Chinese, Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, and Russian. All right, but because there's nothing sacred about those instructions other than the way that they're written, even in English. Remember, you're trying to use these instructions to help the child understand the task, not to necessarily take the test. So if you want to translate these into another language that's not listed of those that already have been done into the English version, then you're more than welcome to do that. The point being that you're trying to get the child merely to comprehend the task. Once they comprehend the task, then you saw, as with Joanna, she tells me what the response is, I click it for her, and I move forward. There's nothing else that you need to translate after that, but you can continue to communicate with the individual in their native language if necessary. And that's probably one of the things that becomes more of a requirement when you're doing it remotely than when you're sitting down next to the person. Remember, when you're sitting next to them, all they have to do is point or touch or click themselves. They don't have to say anything to you, but remotely, they have to communicate what they want to point to because you can't see what they're pointing to directly. And so therefore it's more difficult. I mean, you could get very creative with this. We don't really want to go too far afield. You could have them hold up a mirror to their screen and then point using that. I mean, there are things you could do. But again, I recommend that you just stick to what's basic, what's simple, having them communicate in whatever way that they can, what their response is. And if you need to translate, these instructions to get them to understand how to do that, then you go ahead and do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Here we have a question in regards to the platform, the visual platform in terms of video sharing that this administration process might work on. Can you provide clarity on what tools we can use?
Probably anything that you work with. So a lot of people are using Zoom these days. Don't like Zoom myself. It's not as secure. WebEx works perfectly well. That's how I set it up with my wife when I was doing it. We're using GoToMeeting here, which is a common one. That would work perfectly all right. Blue Jeans is another one that I think has been somewhat popular. People use it. There's any number of video conferencing platforms that would be suitable. They all have pretty much the same types of options, pretty much the same kind of setup, and pretty much the same ability to handle whatever you want to do, which is to share your screen, or at least share the application, right, in windowed format. So you're sharing the screen, but put it in windowed format. Allow the video to be up there so that you can see them. Whether they see you or not doesn't really matter. As long as you can see them, that's what you need to do. So virtually any platform will work just fine.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Here we have another question about the actual administration in terms of the audio. Are we allowed to repeat the audio a couple of times, or do we have to wait for the examinee to request this?
I think that one is something you play by feel. Ordinarily, I would wait for the examinee to request it, then you say it. Now, you told them with the instructions that they're allowed to ask for you to repeat it. If you have a sense, though, because you're observing them, that they look a little confused or maybe not sure, or maybe something happened that might have distracted the stimulus, then go ahead and repeat it for them. There's no limit to the repetition they can request. So if you want to make sure that they hear it and you want to repeat it, I think that's perfectly okay. Again, the stimulus word will be repeated in a standardized fashion. It's already built in. If they didn't hear it properly the first time, then play it again. If they request it, play it again. If they don't, but you think they need it, go ahead and play it again. You can certainly ask them. You can say, would you like to hear the word again? And if they say, yeah, then you go ahead and do it.
Perfect. Thank you. sorry, let me just find another question here.
Sure.
Here we have a question about the PVAT dual norms. Can you clarify more about how to determine the length of exposure to English for English learners?
Yes. You know, when you get to the setup and you've started the application and you're beginning to prepare before you're actually going to do the testing, and you click English learner norms, then it asks you basically a question that is similar to, at what age did the examinee first begin to learn English actively? And what you're trying to assess here is how much time they have actually been learning English. And learning English doesn't simply mean, well, they've been listening to the radio or they watch some TV. You know, watching cartoons, excuse me, is not an active way of learning English. What you're looking for is who has actually been present in that child's environment that has been actively trying to get them to understand, to learn, to use English. So you're looking at parent usage, you're looking at maybe older sibling usage, you're looking at formal instruction and education, maybe even preschool formal education. So things like that. And you can use what you know from your language developmental background, the knowledge that you gain from interviewing the parents, interviewing the examinee about what they've been through, to gauge that. So, for example, I often hear the question, somebody says, well, I've got one parent that speaks only one language, English, and the other parent speaks only the other language, and that's, you know, let's say Urdu. And then, you know, so when did they start learning English? At birth? Well, technically that's true, but you must understand, you can't learn two languages simultaneously. You don't have two parents speaking two languages, one in each ear, all at the same time. You're hearing one for some time, you're hearing the other for some time. So in other words, you're splitting your time. So if the child starts learning English actively, let's say when school starts, and that's where the majority of English takes place, then before that, you could say by age 5, they would have had half of their time in English. So you'd say 2.5 years, and then that would give them about a 50% lifetime exposure starting in kindergarten. So you can use your judgment to figure out how much time have they been learning English. Remember, the norms will compare them to other individuals who've been learning English for the same amount of time. So you want to gauge how much time that has actually been. And it'll go from 1% all the way to 99%. It's not like low exposure versus moderate exposure versus high exposure. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way to 99%. And so the more accurate you can be, the more accurate they will be compared to whom they should be compared, which is true peers. Now, that's not easy to do, but it's not something that can be easily quantified anyway. You have to take a good language history and developmental history in terms of language to be able to figure that out and come to the best guess. You can always modify it, by the way, even after you've generated the report. If you find that you made a mistake in terms of how much exposure they've had, you can go back, change the amount of exposure, and have it rescored. It doesn't even cost you another protocol. It's part of what you can do. The only thing you can't change pretty much is the date of birth, because that might have changed the starting point of the child based on the screener and their responses. So if the date of birth is messed up, generally speaking, you're going to have to retest. Unless you're okay with the results and it was only a day or two off, you can change the date of birth in the My Clients kind of section of your MHS portal. But other than that, if you want to change the amount of exposure, you can do so. It's not easy, I understand, but it's what must be done to ensure that you're comparing the child not just to other 10-year-olds who are English learners, but 10-year-olds who've been learning English for exactly the same amount of time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz. We are coming to the end of our session here, and we still have quite a few questions. So if you could give me control back of the screen, I'd love to share some information with everyone to learn more, and hopefully so we can address the rest of the questions here.
Okay.
Just give me a moment.
I think you have it now.
I believe I do.
Yes, you do.
So thank you all so much for your questions. Unfortunately, we are at the end of today's session, but if you'd like to learn more, please know that we have a number of MHS representatives here to support you. On this slide and the following, you will find the information of all the education and clinical assessment consultants Depending on where you're located, please feel free to contact your specific rep, and they will be able to help you with your questions. This slide here, it displays the MHS clinical and healthcare assessment consultants based on location in the United States and Canada. And this slide here displays the contact information for the education consultants. And all this information will be included in our follow-up email to you. So no need to worry if you are not able to jot that down. But once again, thank you all so much for joining us today and taking time out of your day to be with us here. We hope you found it time well spent. I'd also like to thank Dr. Ortiz for speaking with us this afternoon. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.